how you got a schedule with a talk listed on it by me that was about a particular thing. That's not going to happen. And then I threw that talk away. It was supposed to be about revision, and then I started writing it, and I started to disagree with everything I was writing. So then I thought, okay, I'll do a talk where I contradict every piece of advice I've ever given. And then I started disagreeing with my disagreements with the advice, and I threw that talk away. And then, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to read you a bunch of stuff that I also probably disagree with. It's like a hodgepodge of essays about writing that I've written and been published, or some of them are blog posts, some of them were in lit mags, some of them were commissioned about aspects of writing that I've published over the past like 5 years. And as I go, they become more, they become less easy to agree with. So I'll leave plenty of time, I hope, for some Q&A so that you can argue with me, and then I can argue with myself and with you, and it'll be good. It'll be a dialogue. We'll have a dialogue. Anyway, so this talk has no title. Amber and I were brainstorming and came up with questions and answers about this talk. So maybe that's the title. The first thing I'm going to read is, this is a very slight thing. And it's about titles, actually. There's a colleague of mine at Cornell that when we have our graduate, what do we call oral exams for our graduate students before they get their degrees. We often come to disagreements about what the titles of their novel or short story collection should be, and we never agree on what makes a good title. So this is a little defense of generic titles for novels, which for some reason I really dig. Well, not for some reason. The reason is in here. It's in the. Okay. After a conversation with a friend last week, it was not really last week. It was a couple of years ago, about my novel progress. I came up with a working title for it, and I ran it by her. She agreed that the title was apt, but thought, quote, that it was a little too generic. I've gotten this comment a lot about a lot of my titles, which in recent years have tended toward concepts expressed in very few words. Mailman, Castle. The working title in question of the novel that I had been writing is Ghosts, and that got shit canned, but I'll tell you about that in a second. I don't think my friend is wrong, but I'd argue that genericness is a valid choice for a title, particularly a novel title. I'm thinking of Coetzee's Disgrace, or Rushdie's Shame, or Robinson's Housekeeping, or Morrison's Beloved. Philip Roth's late work has embraced the generic. Indignation, Nemesis, Everyman. And then parenthetically I say, Everyman? I mean, that's like the genericest title ever. These are good titles in my view, because they rather boldly colonize a broad concept. They speak of a certain kind of confidence. I can appreciate the cover-clogging independent clause titles of, say, Flannery O'Connor, Everything That Rises Must Converge, or my friend Brian Hall, I would be extremely happy in your company. These are immediately striking and original, but I'm probably in the minority thinking that Carver's best title is not what we talk about when we talk about love, which feels like a cold sore on my tongue every time I'm forced to say it, but Cathedral. Cathedral, Ray? Do tell. A good generic title is a vessel into which meaning can be poured by both the writer and reader. My favorite of my own titles, by a wide margin, is Familiar, which is my last novel, because it connotes so much that the novel attempts to address. The family, of course, the uncanny, the notion of a magical companion or familiar. Away from its antecedent, the generic title goes unnoticed. It's something anyone might say at any time, but once it is in place on the book cover, gravitational lines bend towards it. The generic title doesn't try to impress you, it tries to indicate that the book itself will impress you. Of course, the problem with the generic title is that if the book sucks, then the title sucks. Ulysses is a great title, but only for Ulysses. Lolita would be a terrible title for a book that wasn't Lolita. The generic title is an invitation to failure. It won't redeem a bad novel. Not that a clever title will, but at least it'll look good when it shows. No, the generic title invites you to throw away the dust jacket. It's a revolt against the very notion of titling. Any summary of this work, it seems to say, is futile. So here, I have a word to chew on. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that I'm notionally fond of untitled works, which are quite common in visual art and music, where we always feel compelled to invent nicknames, which then become the real titles in people's minds. The White Album, Led Zeppelin 4. There aren't many untitled novels out there, though, if any. Maybe that's where I'm headed. First, I'll drop down to one syllable in defiance of my friend, and then in a few years, one letter. Pynchon and Tom McCarthy already claimed B and C, alas. And at last, I shall issue my masterpiece, a novel by J. Robert Lennon. Someone asked me to write about collaboration, which I had recently at the time published a collection of stories that were inspired by photo collages that a friend of mine had made, and what I thought would be kind of a vexing, complicated process ended up generating very different kind of work than I would have made otherwise, and I still really like this project. So this is called Notes on Collaboration. When I was in high school, I tried to collaborate on a novel with two of my friends, Jack and JJ. I can't remember how it started. Probably we were bored at lunch, and one of us had an unused spiral notebook. But this project would become not only the first sustained in both time and length piece of fiction I attempted, but also the first serious artistic collaboration. Okay, not serious. The novel was in fact ridiculous in the extreme. A Douglas Adams-style bit of sci-fi slapstick, featuring our own fictional avatars engaged in picaresque adventures, with a rotating cast of extemporaneously generated fools and rogues, many in possession of tentacles or silken for brains. We took turns passing the notebook around between classes or biking it over to each other's house on the weekend, and nothing we wrote was really any good. What was serious was the intensity of our efforts. For the better part of the year, work on the novel became far more important than school, and girls, and even our Dungeons and Dragons group. And you could tell that it was serious because when we started fucking with each other, we got really angry. That's what happens, of course, when you collaborate. The other guy goes against the grain. And when he does, you have to react. Jack would think of a plot device, or JJ a character, and when the notebook landed in my hands, I could tell how attached they'd become to their contributions. And I couldn't resist. I would crush the device, or kill the character. And when my own inspiration struck, I could be sure that I would soon face its wholesale destruction in the hands of my so-called friends. Eventually, the roadblocks overwhelmed everything else, and the project ground to a halt. But the experience stuck with me. After that, I knew how to collaborate. I knew when to push back and when to stand down. How to give up my own fine ideas for the good of the project, and how to accept other people's ideas that didn't speak to me in the moment. In my career, I've managed to collaborate on creative projects often. A tag team story with a friend, a collection of photographs that begat poems, a collection of stories inspired by illustrations, a lecture turned concert, a screenplay. But the most important collaboration I've learned to engage in is the same one every good writer does. The collaboration between the version of the self, who writes first drafts, and the version that edits them. Indeed, I suspect that every good writer is in fact two writers, the one who is able to suppress the fear and self-disgust that can derail any creative effort, and the one who is able to dismiss inspiration as so much bullshit, and brass knuckle a manuscript into place. Or shape, sorry. Or place, you can put it anywhere, I guess. I'm sure the experience is different for everyone, but my writer number one is insufferable. A manic, self-aggrandizing loon who won't shut up about himself. While my writer number two is the picture of refinement and calm. Editing and revising are the things I can budget time for, set limits for, meet deadlines for. Drafting is the thing that makes me stay in bed all day, quietly chuckling to myself. Luckily for the people around me, I spend more time as number two than I do number one. And despite the romantic popular notion of the writer as drunkard, Lothario, and cad, I suspect most other writers do too. Collaboration, in the end, is less about accepting others than it is about giving up the self. And it's this notion that makes all the difference when you're working, as most of us do, most of the time, alone. Okay. I didn't know how to pronounce this French phrase that I've typed many times. And it's trompe-l'œil, right? Loy? Does anyone speak French? I asked YouTube to pronounce it for me. Anyway, it's a realistic-looking painting, essentially, that is put in a place that makes it look like, for instance, a building that makes it look like the road that leads to the building continues through the building. So this is called a trompe-l'œil for the mind's ear. And it's about dialogue. Someone asked me to write about dialogue. The key to writing realistic dialogue in fiction is to abandon all presumption of authenticity and acknowledge the necessity of total fakeness in achieving the illusion of truth. Human speech is not simple. The words we say in conversation convey at best 25% of what we mean. Footnote, a completely specious figure that I just made up. With the remaining 75% taken up by body language, volume, and tone, facial expression, and prior understanding between parties. The fiction writer has access to these conversational elements, of course, and may fill in backstory, provide stage direction, and apply, judiciously, descriptive dialogue tags to convey the intended meaning. But a good writer can evoke the character of the speaker, his or her intended and actual meaning, and even very subtle contextual clues using only words within quotation marks. Among the tools the writer has at her disposal when writing dialogue: sentence length, punctuation, rhythm, along an axis of consistency from entirely smooth to completely broken, syntax and diction, specifically its breadth, expressive sophistication, and degree of formal correctness. The reader should be able to understand who is speaking in the same way that he requires no assistance to identify, by sound alone, the voices of his friends in a crowded room. I often instruct my students to use their phones, footnote, with the disclaimer that this practice is probably illegal, to record overheard conversations. Then to go home and transcribe the recordings verbatim. From this invariably sloppy text, I ask them to try to render persuasive and coherent fictional dialogue. This process can help to reveal the underlying logic or illogic of a conversation, the hidden intent of the speakers, their insecurities, and unacknowledged desires. Footnote, if I were a marriage therapist, I would record my clients' conversations with each other, then transcribe them into readable dialogue for their perusal. I would probably not be a very good marriage therapist. The most common mistake beginning writers make when writing dialogue is to assume that conversations consist of people listening to each other and then responding to what they have heard. In reality, people spend at least some of their conversational time planning what they're going to say next, while paying only cursory attention to their interlocutors. The spectrum of conversational styles extends from the careful and patient talker, who punctuates her listening with nods and facial reactions, pauses before responding, and offers only the minimum required speech in return, to the unrepentant blabberer, who cuts off his companion mid-sentence, expresses himself in big looping dependent clauses that terminate somewhere deep inside a bewildering cognitive spiral, and reveals things about himself he thinks he's keeping secret. Both of these extremes can be very interesting people to talk to, for very different reasons. They, and everyone in between, can serve as excellent models for a fictional conversation. But remember, it's all fake. Invite actors to recite your excellent fictional dialogue and listen to it as it emerges stagey and stiff. Good dialogue is a construct. In her 1990 book-length essay, The Journalist and the Murderer, Janet Malcolm warns of the danger of journalist-transcribed speech. Nobody likes the way they sound transcribed, even if, especially if, the transcription is exact. Quote, "The literally true," she writes, "may actually be a kind of falsification of reality. When we talk with somebody, we are not aware of the strangeness of the language we're speaking. Our ear takes it in as English, and only if we see it transcribed verbatim do we realize that it is a kind of foreign tongue." Or alternately, it's the printed dialogue that is the foreign tongue, of which every fiction writer needs to develop her own dialect. Dialogue is a trompe-l'oeil for the mind's ear, a shapely illusion that expresses the truth behind every truth, behind the truth about the way we talk. Way to mess up the end. A shapely illusion that expresses the truth behind the truth about the way we talk. Anyway. Okay, now this one's about money. It's called Right to Suffer, Published to Starve. I feel like writers should talk about money more, because we don't make much, and the little that we do make is almost never can sustain a life. So if you're passionate about writing and you want to publish, you kind of have to have a backup plan. I mean, I think I've published 9 books. By any reasonable metric, I think I can be considered successful at writing, but there is absolutely no way I could live off of my And I think that comes as a surprise to some people who are starting out, that money is I mean, everybody worries about money, but I think that writers are kind of laboring under an illusion that if you publish a book, you're a big deal, thus you have money. And you're not a big deal if you publish a book and you don't have money. So, so I wanted to write a little bit about money. I mean, I'm a big deal, but for other reasons. Okay. Oh, and this is coming out in, I can't remember the name of it. I think it's called Scratch, and it's writers writing about money, an anthology that's coming out in the next year, edited by Manuel Martin, who edits a website. I should remember the name of the freaking website too. It's a thing that's coming out at a time, and it's edited by a lady who writes a thing. So go look that up. I write for my pleasure, Vladimir Nabokov wrote to his publisher, Maurice Girodias, in 1955, in an effort to extract from him the delayed second half of the Advance for Lolita. But I publish for money. This beloved quotation serves as a succinct abstract for an aspirational philosophy most writers at least sort of embrace. We create our art without regard for its extrinsic value, deep inside our batcave of rectitude. And only once the work has met our approval as a fully realized expression of our aesthetic ideals do we issue it into the world in the hope, shruggingly expressed through professional intermediaries, that someone might be willing to pay us for it. On the face of it, this philosophy seems unambiguously useful, fiscally pragmatic, and mojo positive. The work's worth in dollars to publishers and readers is immaterial in this conception of the writer's purpose. Whether we are given a six-figure advance, industry parlance for $95,000, for our blue crystal meth art object, or a virtual stack of mildly insulting rejection emails matters not at all. There's writing, there's commerce, and between them stands an impenetrable wall of inestimably thick, bulletproof glass. The writer can make out the agents and editors and publicists over there on the other side of the glass if she presses her nose to the wall's scratchless, ungouged, greasy, and slightly blood-stained surface. The wall, its integrity-preserving inviolability, bending and scattering light, diffuses and warps their horrifying corporeal forms as they intermingle like eels in a tank, their mouths opening and closing, their chests convulsing with silent laughter, their meaty pink hands coming into direct contact with actual money. But don't peek. It's not healthy. Indeed, the writer should stand as far from the wall as he can, facing away into the black void of creation, where all that can be made out in the cigarette-y gloom are the slightly crooked contours of a battered desk, the squat, platypusian outline of a manual typewriter, a minor alp of scribbled upon and balled up paper, and a second-hand pine bookshelf, sagging from the weight of every word every other writer has managed to publish since 1439, when Johannes Gutenberg brought to Europe from the Holy Roman Empire the device that would eventually be employed to transform our profoundest thoughts, emotions, and desires into a form that insects can comfortably nest in, and that doubles in size if you drop it in the bathtub. Here's the problem, though, with the Nabokovian dicta. For most of us, writing is not particularly pleasurable, and publishing does not make us much money. Most writers I know work in a state of perpetual anxiety and self-disgust, and regard the products of their labor as profoundly disappointing. I don't wish to embrace the cliché, as pernicious as the one I've so far spent this essay mocking, of the tortured artist, in the self-mythologizing and eye-rollingly hackneyed words of Paul Auster, bleeding words onto a page. Writing is not coal mining. It is merely a pain in the ass, albeit one that tends to invite psychic distress, especially given the bewilderment with which it is greeted by a writer's loved ones, once they realize what one actually does all day while writing, i.e., not much. Maybe a more appropriate rallying cry would be, write to suffer, publish to starve. In all honesty, I've quoted the Nabokov line to graduate students hundreds of times. In the hothouse environment of the writing workshop, it's a handy reminder that, despite our career ambitions, we should focus on the work when we're at work and worry about publishing later. But I'm wary of discouraging students, or any writer really, from developing a relationship to the idea of commerce. That separation of art and commerce, while a noble aim, is in reality an endeavor akin in the rarefied and impoverished professional universe where writers actually reside to the separation of smoking and drinking. A nice thought, but yeah, good luck with that. Besides, commerce is more than money. It was fine for Nabokov to tell his publisher that he published for money, for it was money Nabokov was trying to secure. But money isn't the only reason to be published, or that anyone publishes. We publish because we are exhibitionists. We publish to be admired. We publish to be part of something that excites us. We publish to feel special, to feel real, to feel brave, to feel afraid. We publish to evoke emotion in others, to prove mom wrong. We publish because other people publish, and that's what is done. We publish so that we can talk to other people who publish about publishing. We publish so that we can get contributors' copies, so that we can get a job, so that we can get laid. We publish for an excuse to go to New York, to have something to flog at conferences, to have something to brag about on airplanes. This is all commerce. Our cocktail party banter with other writers is commerce. Our blog posts about books we like or loathe are commerce. Our barroom readings and subtweets are commerce. We parlay our genetic predisposition to language and our hard work developing it into companionship, attention, admiration, criticism. This is normal, and we all do it. It is the rare serious writer who does not wish to publish. There's only one in recent memory, J.D. Salinger. Certainly it is possible to regard Salinger as a paragon of literary integrity. He wrote precisely what he wanted for decades and showed it to no one. But the posthumous masterworks we have hoped for have so far failed to materialize. Perhaps they're forthcoming. Or perhaps they fall further along the axis of disconnection from reality established by Salinger's last published story, Hapworth 16, 1924, an epistolary novella that appeared in The New Yorker in June of 1965, in which, aside from its inalienable lastness, is noteworthy mostly for its tiresome digressions, obscure stylistic flourishes, and twee self-absorption. It's pretty bad. It reads like the work of a man who hates to be read. Our commerce with the world is not corollary to our art. It is rather a vital component of our art, perhaps our art's reason for being. If we regard writing as an act of empathy that presupposes and celebrates the existence of other people, then its commerce with humanity must represent its consummation. The money is just so that we can eat, or keep a roof over our heads, or in the pitiful amounts that are typically involved in an exchange between writer and publisher of a literary product, and mildly apologetic acknowledgement of labor. But money isn't the real currency here. The real currency of literary commerce is love. Now, I'm not singing Kumbaya to lit biz, saying that we all have to be besties, plump for each other on Facebook, and get drunk together at AWP. Although, C&DC, next break. I'm not advocating short stories with happy endings, though seriously, try one sometime. Or schlock poems about adorable animals. I'm saying that every writer needs to conceive, develop, and maintain a literary relationship to her family, her country, her community, her peers. A writer ought to be thinking about this, yes, when he sends his work out to be published, but also when he's writing it, and when he's contemplating writing it. A literary work unconcerned with the desires of its audience is like a thoughtless gift, a crass experiment in social engineering, like the statue of Jesus your pious aunt bought for your atheist front garden and expects a thank you note for. What the theoretical separation of art and commerce is meant to prevent is, of course, pandering. Good art is not supposed to service the lazy reader. It's supposed to challenge, surprise. It is supposed to change the world. But you aren't going to change the world without loving it first, even if you love it in the most resentful, confused, exasperated, imaginable way. Respect the world even as it pisses you off. Otherwise you'll produce nothing but hermity manifestos, bursts of static from your own private yada. Art and commerce are not separate. They're not even different. Write to suffer, publish to starve, and have the courage to give your work a purpose, to want a future for it, however painful it may be to hope. I was wondering if you were laughing at me or just something you were.
No, your own private yada is one of the better lines I've ever heard.
Okay, so I have a couple of more of these brief things, and then if you want to do some Q&A. Do you want? I'll go ahead and read these, and then you can interrogate me or disagree with me or what have you. All right, this one. there's a thing I hate. And it's the piece of writing advice. You just gotta put your ass in the chair. And this piece tells why I hate that. And it's kind of these next two things are sort of from a writing teachery point of view. They're a little bit focused on someone who teaches writing, which I am. So that's kind of where it's pitched at. The ass in chair canard. I was planning to start this piece with a series of writing advice quotes from a variety of writers. The quotes were all going to be some variation on the classic, put your ass in the chair and write admonition. I knew I'd heard a lot of people say this, and I figured I could work up a pretty nice list with a web search. Anyway, I'd like to invite you to Google ass, chair, write. Go ahead. You'll discover that not only has this been said by pretty much every extremely prolific writer ever, it is almost always said exactly the same way. Ass in the chair, butt in the chair. Apply ass to chair. Chair, meet butt, etc. It goes without saying that this is an incredibly vapid cliche, and one that should never be repeated, if only for fear of boring one's listeners to death. How to write? Write. But its implications run deeper than that. The phrase is in fact an insult to almost everyone who has ever struggled with the creative process, and as a teaching tool is liable to do more harm than good. It embraces several dangerous lies. That writer's block is the result, first and foremost, of laziness, that writing, indeed any creative pursuit, is like any other form of labor, and that how hard you work on something is directly correlated with how good it is. When I first started teaching, I figured I would be able to build a library of writerly lessons, stuff that always works, that can get any writer out of a jam. I used to fantasize about writing a writing advice book, in fact. One of those step-by-step guides that bring you from blank page to published novel, complete with exercises and witty anecdotes. Nowadays, I know I'm not going to do that. Very little about my own writing experience is applicable to any of my students. A few of them, perhaps, every now and then, but for the most part, no. It turns out that I'm prolific, and writing is relatively easy for me. Like any working writer, I spend many hours a day on my writing, and many more thinking about it, and I can definitely be said to work hard at it. But I'm not depressed, I'm not plagued by self-doubt, I do not get writer's block, and I'm not bothered by others' regard for what I do. These are not moral victories, and they are not the result of clever techniques I've devised. They're in my nature, and I've found that telling people how I do what I do is only useful to them if they are exactly like me, which of course nobody is. Are not especially snowflakes. Here's the correct way to advise somebody. Love them, respect them, know them, read their stuff, understand where they're coming from. If they're your students, talk to them in class and during your office hours. Ask them how it feels when they can't finish something. Ask them how it feels when they can. Help them get at their obsessions. It's possible that they aren't really trying very hard, and in an undergraduate workshop this is sometimes the case. Writing really isn't for everybody, and we have a reputation for giving out a lot of A's. But usually they are trying, sometimes far harder than you have ever tried to do anything. Sometimes they are crying at their desks at night. Sometimes they would rather die than have to finish their poem or short story. If you are not like that, it isn't because you are better, it's because you are different. Your own experience isn't worthless, but if you think something that works for you might work for a student or friend, put it in terms that acknowledge that you are different. Here's something that works for me. Why don't you try it? What would you do if you were like them? Suggest that. Offer your student or friends some exercises that might allow them to find the thread themselves. You're not going to find it for them, especially not by implying that they don't work hard enough. Because that's what we're doing when we tell somebody, put their ass in the chair and write. We're assuming, usually incorrectly, that this is not something they are already engaged in, when in fact there is nobody who has ever tried to do anything in their life who does not already know that this is step one. When you tell somebody to put their ass in the chair, you are in effect saying, your problem is that you're lazy. If you were more like me, you'd get more done. You are in effect saying, I'm better than you are. You're saying, fuck you. Writing is not like stacking firewood. It's not like washing the dishes. It isn't like anything but itself. It is a mode of self-expression that requires the exposure to one's own conscious mind of one's own most deeply protected beliefs, desires, and fears. And ass-chair contact hours engaged in this mess do not necessarily result in anything good. This varies from one writer to the next, and for any given writer, from 1 hour to the next. You can spend 6 months on 20 shitty pages, and 6 hours on 20 brilliant ones. None of it makes any sense. So instead of breezily telling someone to put their ass in the chair, how about acknowledging that life is hard, that writing is hard, that we really don't know what it's like to be somebody else, and that it isn't particularly special to be you. And if somebody tells you to put your ass in the chair, I urge you to reply, thanks, asshole. If we all get on the same page, maybe we can put an end to this obscene plague once and for all. Applauding the guy who just gave advice that says that all advice is stupid. Virginia?
Yeah, I Googled it, but it's just you, which is cheating. That's what comes up, the admonition of ass and chair, or how writing it actually work. And I was like, wow, he's right, it does just come up, and then I was like, it's him. Cheating.
I'm winning the battle. Okay, last thing. This is I'll do one more thing, and then we can discuss what you've heard here this morning. And then I think there'll be some announcements too before we go to class. I'm kind of in trouble for this. I lost a friend over this essay. I kind of made up with him, but he's a sensitive guy. Okay. For lack of a better title, this is called Literary Fiction is Fucking Boring. Oh dear. And I wrote this a couple years ago in response. Dan Shawn, who I'm going to quote here, is not the guy I alienated. But I was in response to something he wrote. What thing he wrote was actually quite reasonable, but I decided to take a reactionary take on it, just to be a bit. In a recent piece on the Review, which is a website, Dan Shawn writes about the need for young writers of literary fiction to emulate their counterparts in music and develop an obsessive interest in the products of the culture they hope to join. He bemoans his students' unfamiliarity with the lit mags they hope to be published in, and encourages them to explore the literary world. He recommends the annual best of short fiction anthologies, and name checks a few good magazines. Young writers, he says in conclusion, if you want to be rock stars, you have to read. On the face of it, this thesis seems impossible to refute, but I'm going to try. It does go without saying that fiction writers ought to be reading, and most of us do, naturally. But I feel as though the particular course of action that Shawn is suggesting, immersing oneself in the world of contemporary literary fiction, is potentially a recipe for hackneyed, insular, boring writing. Shawn's argument is perhaps stronger when applied to the world of poetry, which, and by the way, the poets should feel free to contradict me on this, because I'm making some assumptions about the poetry world that maybe are not correct. Shawn's argument is perhaps stronger when applied to the world of poetry, which is smaller than that of fiction, and more dependent upon a robust dialogue with itself. The world of poetry is also less risk-averse than that of fiction. Poets are naturally more experimental, less embarrassed about strong and unpleasant emotion. Poets aren't bothered by the same career anxieties fiction writers are. They don't presume there is any money to be made doing what they do. And poetry is less concerned, not unconcerned certainly, but less so, than fiction with the common idioms of storytelling. Poets are constantly reinventing language. A poet ignores new writing at his or her peril. But I don't think Shawn's advice is necessarily beneficial to fiction writers. For one thing, most contemporary literary fiction is terrible, mannered, conservative, and obvious. Most of the stories in the annual best of anthologies are mediocre, as are the stories that populate most magazines. It's inevitable that this should be so. Fiction writing is ludicrously popular. Too many people are doing it, and most of them are bound to be bad at it. MFA programs, while of great benefit to talented writers, have had the effect of rendering a lot of lousy writers borderline competent. And many of these competent writers get stories and books published. It's so terrible. This is not an anti-MFA rant, by the way. I love the program, I studied it, and I love it when I teach it, and enjoy helping students do their best, even when it doesn't end up being very good. As a result, the dialogue literary fiction writers are having with themselves is by and large uninteresting. It isn't that there aren't smart people writing and conversing. It's just that the lit-fic world is so enormous, the noise tends to overwhelm the signal. Shawn takes his students to task for their shallow knowledge of contemporary fiction. And I'm quoting him here. When I ask them what they've read recently, they frequently only manage to cough up the most obvious high-profile examples, unquote. But maybe that isn't such a bad thing. There's more superb fiction already extant in the world than any of us will be able to read in our lifetimes. Why develop an encyclopedic knowledge of the present cultural moment when so much of it inevitably is crap? In my view, a good writer can learn something from anything he or she reads. And so I certainly don't begrudge a student reading any piece of contemporary fiction. In fact, I assign the annual best of anthologies as textbooks in my workshops. until my students last semester said, "Can we stop? Can you give us something good to read?" More often than not, our discussions of the assigned readings, initiated by students, not by me, center on what makes the story so goddamn awful. This is useful and good. But a fiction writer ought to engage in other parts of the culture too. This includes reading outside of one's genre. I happen to favor sci-fi and mystery, but I think it's fine for literary writers to read YA, romance, fantasy, or whatever they please. Literary writers are in the privileged position of being permitted to raid any genre for tools to subvert and repurpose. We ought to be reading poetry too, of course, and nonfiction. We should read instruction manuals, legal documents, restaurant reviews, and corporate newsletters. We should follow weird people on Twitter, go to lots of parties, and have lots of intense and ridiculous conversations with drunk people. We should go home for the holidays and argue with our families, and we ought to listen to lots of music, and we ought to watch plenty of television, because television is at the moment the most artistically important narrative medium. We should eavesdrop, and we should gossip. We should probably be in therapy. We should probably drink more coffee. Let's face it, literary fiction is fucking boring. It really is. It's a genre as replete with cliches as any. And when you're as deeply immersed in it, as many of us are, it's all too easy to stop noticing the cliches. They no longer stand out. They're just what people do. And so we do them. If a writer of literary fiction wants to be great, she needs to poke her head up out of the echo chamber every now and then and absorb the genuine peculiarity of human striving. And that means reading stuff that is not literary fiction, and sometimes not reading at all. Bye. Comments?
Sorry, someone actually brought me that essay in Missoula once and was like, I think you'd get along with this guy. Yeah, I had a question. You were talking about the inaccuracy of the inscription.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how I have this habit of repeating back to you what you've said. Like, how do you...
Just in conversation?
Yeah, because we think so differently, and I'm like, what? Like, how do you use that funhouse mirror to your advantage? Like, taking the literal and making it into convincing fiction? Or am I way off track with thinking about what you're saying?
I often hand out, I think I have a PDF of it if anybody wants it. I often hand out that chunk of, that scene in James Welch's Winter in the Blood, where they're all in the bar talking to the man with who tore up his airplane ticket, and there's like 3 or 4 conversations, and everyone is just talking to themselves at other people, and the conversations are just sailing over each other's heads. And I think it's a perfect example of the way a lot of conversation is kind of solipsistic. Like it's, you just, like, I feel like 90% of sometimes 90% of your conversation is just like you have someone to open your mouth in front of. So I feel like, so it comes from character, right? Like when you're off your guard, what comes out, And I think that when we're sort of super deeply engaged in the conversation and we're kind of grooving on it, we begin to reveal ourselves in unexpected ways. And so it's going to depend on the particular story you're trying to write and the particular character that the words are coming out of. But I feel like often people just don't know what they're revealing about themselves when they talk, and they misremember. They remember themselves coming off one way, and they actually came off another way. If we tend to be self-critical, we think I just made an ass of myself, and meanwhile everyone's thinking what a charming person that was, And if we're full of ourselves, everyone's like, "You believe that guy?" And we're like, "Well, I did it again." But I feel like there are different axes along which this blindness can land for artistic purposes. Transcribing conversations, and yes, it is illegal. But
No, it's not actually.
oh really?
Well, it is in California, but don't ask me why I know that.
But it is kind of instructive because people's speech patterns are drastically different, and I think that that's a note I often give on manuscripts is like these may be good characters, but when they open their mouths, they all kind of sound like the narrative, and people actually sound drastically different from each other. And you don't have to use a lot of like adverbs and the tags to indicate how people are talking. Just the syntax and diction can speak volumes about where a person is coming from and what kind of person. So I'm sure you have it.
I wanted to go back to your point about literary fiction. In your opinion, who are some writers that get it right? So that when you read them, you're like, okay, you guys, you have it right.
There's lots. I mean, this is a kind of, you're catching me off guard. I'm really like, what novels have I read? I really liked Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill. I think she's really good. I like Jeff Vandermeer's Area X trilogy of science fiction novels. Tom McCarthy's Remainder is a book I teach a lot. It's a British novel that came out like 10 years ago, maybe. It's been really influential on me. I like ZZ Packer's stories. I haven't read Zadie Smith lately, except for her nonfiction, but I think she's like really robustly interrogating language and class. And who else am I into? Can anyone remind me who I like?
Mary Robeson, maybe?
Yeah, I really love Mary Robeson. Who's kind of a writer's writer. I think she lives in Florida and publishes very infrequently. And is a great sort of spare prose stylist. And I've she's retired now, but I love Alice Munro's short stories very much. And the writers I'm mentioning are just all over the map in terms of style and intent. And there are some people on the sort of like alt-lit or experimental side of things. Like I really like Tao Lin's book, Taipei. What else? Talk to me, Meryl. I've had a drink.
The flip side of that, can you give us some examples of these horrible cliches of literary fiction you want further to take down?
I actually, part of the talk I abandoned was a big list of cliches. I don't think I want to do that. I do feel like, all right, so I'll say this. There was a year. I read a lot of applications for the Cornell MFA program. We get about 600 fiction applications a year. And I get about 500 fiction submissions at Okey-Panky every 6 months. And they're mostly people who are youngish, especially the MFA applications, and who are trying to engage with literary culture. And there was 1 year for the applications where I'd say a third of the stories were about sexually abused adolescent girls or sexually abused adolescent girls in the South. It was like, and I think it was like writers who came out of college, like who are educated and come from a position of privilege, who want to kind of grab a little authenticity. And then that is one reason a lot of writers resort to cliches, because they want to appear that they're getting at the gritty truth about life, right? But the fact is, like, being a semantics major at Brown is an actual experience. Like, you can write about that. Like, you can write about your life in a way that is compelling, or the lives of people who are like you. And of course, you should write about all kinds of people. You should try to get to know all different kinds of people and understand how they live. But you do not, by default, have to discount your own experience. And I think a lot of writers do that. And when they do, they're like, all right, well, what's kind of interesting and weird to me? Oh, this type of person. So I'll write about that type of person. But they don't do it from the point of view of that person being first and foremost a person. They start from that person being first and foremost a category of person. And that results in, instead of the kind of eccentric, idiosyncratic way that people's personalities are actually expressed, we get preconceived ideas about the way people are. And I think this is a common mistake among people who are starting out, kind of want to do something different from what everyone in their fiction workshops does. But I think when writers who have some talent pursue their obsessions and try to get at the stuff that preoccupies them, the sort of class and cultural sameness that they might perceive about themselves falls away, and they become, we get the kind of pure stream of consciousness that you get from any I mean, we're all freaking weird. Everybody's weird, you know? It's just like, depending on our social class and level of privilege, we might have more tools for like appearing not to be weird, you know? But under all that, everyone is very different from each other, and it's very strange. I'm getting scared with all that. Anybody else?
First, can I just give the name of the James Welch story you said?
Oh, Winter in the Blood. It's a short novel. It came out in the 70s, and Virginia and I both went to University of Montana, where he didn't teach there, but he lived in Missoula, and was a really heroic figure there. One of my all-time favorite writers. But I highly recommend that book.
And then where do you stand when writers or tend to put a lot of like dropping G's, like apostrophes, and trying to like capture a dialect or an accent and then overusing it?
Yeah, I am.
How do you balance that?
I'm not going to come down on one side or the other of that. I tend not to like to do that, and I tend to find it mannered and distracting when I'm reading it. That said, I've occasionally found it effective, especially in a comedy, where the people's patterns of speech are being like, the differences in the way people speak are being comically inflated. It can be effective. I do think, though, that this is really hard to get your brain around when you're writing, that you want to transcribe what you hear, but I think the more effective way to do dialect is through word choice and syntax. Wait, is diction word choice? What's the difference between syntax and diction?
Diction is word choice, syntax is sentence structure.
Okay, yeah. So syntax is sentence structure, diction is word choice, and those two things can get you 90% of the way to making the person sound like they really sound. In colloquial English, anyway. Right? I don't know what the how people write the other languages do it, but I feel like most of like all American subcultures you can evoke through the correct word choices and sentence structure, usually. I'm sure someone can come up with exceptions, but yeah.
Just to jump off that, on the diction and when to use and not to, I remember reading Your Eyes Were Watching God. Now, it took me 40, 50 pages to get into it because of the diction.
Yeah.
But once you got into it, the diction was, the sound and music was incredible. So to have put that back into ordinary, she would have lost, I would have lost it all. Do you know what I mean? So there's
Sure.
like two sides.
Well, it's one, and she was a great prose stylist as well. And I feel like you wouldn't want to take that away from her and sort of flatten out that work, right? So, it's one of those things, like, it doesn't work unless it works. But I feel like if it's one, what I find I often tell students who are trying to extend themselves in every direction at once in an experimental way, you've got to pick your battles. Like, you want there to be some barriers to entry to a work of literature, right? We're not in this to make everybody feel like slipping into a warm bubble bath. We want them to feel challenged a little bit. But if you choose too many vectors of challenge, it will confound the reader rather than seduce them. I think the idea should be to make them think, this is a little off-putting, but kind of interesting. And by 10 pages in, it's like, this is a little confounding, but it's really interesting, right? So these things that might seem like, might frustrate a reader on the surface, later become part of the fabric of the work that is exciting. But if there are too many different ways in which the writer is setting off fireworks, you will just say, just forget it. And even a careful reader who teaches writing and teaches literature at times, I give up on a lot of books. So I don't know. And also there are also people who just will never listen to me and will intentionally be obfuscating, and that's a legitimate way to be, because there are some people who have been interestingly obfuscated. Gertrude Stein. It's like I didn't get her for a decade, and then one day I was like, okay, you're having a real good time doing that. I'm not gonna just go off with that, you know? And then once you accept that it's nonsense, it starts to make sense, you know? That it's sensible nonsense.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were talking about how to help someone, how to give someone advice and know them and listen to them. And then I was wondering if you had any advice as the writer in the workshop, how to sift through like what might make sense for you to take away and what sort of doesn't. And
I think it's hard, especially in a context like this where we only get to know each other for a few days. Because I feel like the best work that happens in my semester-long workshops is after everyone is sort of likes each other and respects each other, or even dislikes each other in a respectful way. So we know okay, I want to say X to this person, but that's not going to work. So I'll say it like this, right? And by the end of the semester, if the mood in the workshop is going well, people know how to talk to each other. And students have sort of picked their 3 or 4 people who they think are really know how to talk to them and get what they're doing and know how to criticize them based on an acceptance of the validity of their project, right? So I feel like if you are in a writing workshop, I think I was just saying to my class yesterday, we get the most, sometimes you're reading something and it's not working, you think it's not very good, and you get mad. Like, if it's not very good and you're not mad, then you can sort of say, okay, well, I think this writer should do this a little better, maybe I'll mark this. But if you start getting mad, it's probably because they're making a mistake that reminds you of yourself, right? That reminds you of your own flaws. And I feel like putting aside that kind of reaction is a really good idea. Like having an open mind about work that is vexing to you, and waiting to see what the writer is like, and so on. So I just, going into it with a spirit of respect, even for a thing that you immediately might dislike, which can be hard, And there's a way in which we all feel like we're a little bit in competition with each other to be real good at writing and win the big prize and get the book deal. But it's a lot more fun and useful to get along. Let's all just get along. All right, I should stop there. I think there are a couple of announcements, and then we'll go to class. Thank you.